I pressed my last crumpled $6 into the cashier's hand with fingers that trembled from exhaustion and cold. Buying bandages and antiseptic for a bleeding stranger who'd collapsed outside my apartment building like some dark angel cast down from heaven. And I had absolutely no idea that 3 days later, armed men in expensive suits would bow before him with their heads lowered in absolute deference while calling him Don Salvatore, or that my entire world was about to be shattered and remade into something I could never have imagined in my wildest, most desperate dreams. The rain that October night fell in sheets so thick and relentless that the whole city seemed to be drowning beneath the weight of the storm, and I was soaked completely through to my skin by the time I stumbled off the last bus, my waitress uniform clinging to me like a second skin, while my worn sneakers squelched with every step I took down the cracked sidewalk toward my building in the warehouse district, where rent was cheap because safety was negotiable, and hope was a luxury most of us couldn't afford. My entire body ached with the bone-deep exhaustion that came from pulling a double shift at Rosie's Diner, where the coffee was terrible and the tips were worse. But it was honest work, and I needed every single dollar if I was going to make rent this month, which is why those 6 crumpled bills in my apron pocket felt like both a victory and a defeat all at once. Because $6 was all that stood between me and complete financial catastrophe, and I'd already mentally allocated every cent toward the ramen noodles and discount bread that would sustain me until my next paycheck arrived in 4 agonizingly long days. The alley beside my building was pitch black, except for the occasional flicker of the one working streetlight half a block away, and I almost didn't see him at all until my foot caught on something solid and warm, and I went sprawling forward with a startled cry that was swallowed immediately by the howling wind and driving rain. My hands hit the wet pavement hard enough to send shooting pains up my wrists, and for a moment I just knelt there in a puddle, stunned and disoriented, before I realized that what I'd tripped over wasn't a pile of garbage or discarded furniture, but a man. A large man dressed in what looked like an expensive suit that was now torn and soaked through with rain, and something darker. Something that my brain registered with horror as blood. So much blood that it pooled around him in a spreading stain that the rain couldn't wash away fast enough. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to get up and sprint into my building and lock every door and pretend I'd never seen anything. Because this was exactly the kind of situation that got people killed in neighborhoods like mine, where looking the other way wasn't just advisable but necessary for survival. And I'd lived here long enough to know that getting involved in someone else's violence was the fastest way to invite that violence into your own life. But then he moved, just slightly, his hand twitching against the wet concrete, and I heard a sound escape his lips that was somewhere between a groan and a gasp. Something so profoundly human and pained that it cut through all my self-preservation instincts like a hot knife through butter. And before I could think better of it, before I could talk myself out of what was probably the most dangerous and stupid decision of my entire life, I was crawling toward him, through the rain and blood, my heart hammering so hard against my ribs that I thought it might actually break through. His face was turned toward the brick wall, half hidden in shadow. But when I carefully, so carefully, reached out to touch his shoulder, he turned his head toward me with movements that seemed to cost him everything he had left, and I found myself staring into eyes that were so dark, they appeared almost black in the dim light, eyes that held an intensity and intelligence that seemed completely at odds with his current state of near-death vulnerability, eyes that looked at me with suspicion and something else, something that might have been desperate hope or perhaps just desperate calculation, as if he was trying to determine whether I was his salvation or his executioner. His face was a study in contrasts, all sharp angles and hard planes that spoke of power and privilege, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw covered in dark stubble, and even pale and bleeding and half-conscious. He was devastatingly, almost cruelly beautiful, in a way that made my breath catch in my throat for reasons that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a pull I felt deep in my chest, some magnetic attraction that I didn't understand and couldn't have explained if someone had demanded I try. The gunshot wound in his shoulder was still bleeding, though not as profusely as it must have been earlier, and I could see where he'd tried to apply pressure with his own hand. his expensive suit jacket wadded up against the injury in a makeshift bandage that was completely soaked through and utterly useless at this point. And I knew with a certainty that came from nowhere and everywhere all at once that if I left him here, if I walked away and pretended I'd never seen him, he would be dead by morning, his body just another statistic in a city that produced them with assembly line efficiency. "Please," he managed to rasp out, his voice rough and low and accented with something European that I couldn't quite place, and his hand shot out with surprising speed to wrap around my wrist with a grip that was weak but insistent, his fingers cold and slick with rain and blood. "Don't call anyone. Don't call the police or ambulance. They'll kill us both. They'll kill you for helping me." I should have been terrified, should have wrenched my arm away and run screaming into the night, because those words confirmed every fear I had about exactly what kind of trouble this man was in. But instead I found myself nodding slowly, my mind already racing through the limited options available to us, and I heard my own voice, sounding far calmer than I felt, asking him if he could walk, if he could make it up 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, because I couldn't leave him in the alley and I couldn't call for help, and the only other choice was to bring him inside and hope that I wasn't signing my own death warrant in the process. He nodded, just barely, and I could see the effort it cost him to remain conscious, to focus his eyes on my face while the rain pounded down on both of us with relentless fury. And I made a decision that would change absolutely everything about my life, though I didn't know it yet. Couldn't have known it as I slipped my arm around his waist and helped him struggle to his feet, with a strength I didn't know I possessed. Getting him up those 3 flights of stairs was a nightmare of epic proportions, with him leaning heavily against me and leaving smears of blood on the dingy wallpaper, while I half carried, half dragged him upward, stopping every few steps so he could catch his breath or fight off what looked like waves of dizziness that threatened to send us both tumbling back down to the ground floor. And by the time I finally got him through my apartment door and onto my sagging second-hand couch, I was shaking and sweating despite the cold, my muscles screaming in protest, and my own clothes now stained with his blood in ways that I knew would never wash out completely. He collapsed against the cushions with a sound that was pure relief mixed with agony, his eyes sliding closed for a moment before forcing themselves open again, as if he was afraid that closing them might mean never opening them again. And I stood there in the middle of my tiny studio apartment, looking at this dangerous stranger bleeding all over my furniture, and wondered what the hell I was supposed to do next. The answer came to me with the clarity of desperation as I dug those $6 precious out of my apron pocket and stared at them for a long moment, knowing that this money was supposed to feed me for the next 4 days, knowing that spending it meant I would go hungry, knowing all of this, and not caring even a little bit, because there was a man dying on my couch, and I couldn't let that happen. I simply couldn't, for reasons I couldn't articulate even to myself. I told him I'd be right back, that he needed to stay awake and stay quiet. And then I was running back down those 3 flights of stairs and out into the rain, sprinting the 2 blocks to the 24-hour convenience store, where the owner knew me by sight and would sell me what I needed without asking questions he definitely didn't want answered. And I burst through the door dripping wet, and probably looking half insane as I grabbed bandages and antiseptic and the strongest painkillers they sold over the counter, counting out my $6 with hands that wouldn't stop shaking while the cashier rang me up with studied indifference that I was pathetically grateful for in that moment. When I got back to my apartment, my heart stopped for a terrible second because he wasn't on the couch where I'd left him, and I thought he'd either died or left, or that someone had come and taken him while I was gone. But then I saw him slumped against the wall near my tiny bathroom, having apparently tried to clean himself up, and made it about halfway there before his strength gave out completely. And the relief that flooded through me was so intense it was almost painful. I helped him back to the couch and then set to work with hands that were surprisingly steady, despite the terror and adrenaline coursing through my system, carefully cutting away his ruined shirt to expose the gunshot wound that looked angry and inflamed, and worse up close than it had seemed in the alley, and I cleaned it as gently as I could while he bit down on a rolled-up dish towel to keep from crying out, his entire body rigid with pain, while sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill in the apartment. His eyes never left my face the entire time I worked on him, watching me with an intensity that should have made me uncomfortable but instead felt almost protective, as if he was memorizing every feature, cataloging every expression, trying to understand who I was and why I was helping him when logic and self-preservation dictated I should have left him to his fate. I could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical touch, burning into me while I bandaged his shoulder with supplies that I knew were inadequate for the severity of his injury. But they were all I had, and they would have to be enough. They had to be enough because the alternative was unthinkable. When I finally finished and sat back on my heels, exhausted and covered in his blood, he reached out with his good hand and caught my wrist again, his grip gentler this time, almost reverent, and he whispered, "Thank you," in that accented voice that sent shivers down my spine, for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold, or the fear, or the absolute insanity of my current situation. I helped him out of the rest of his wet clothes, trying not to notice the hard planes of muscle beneath skin that was marked with scars both old and new, trying not to think about what kind of life produced a body like that, covered in evidence of violence survived and battles fought. And I got him into my bed because the couch was too small and too uncomfortable, and he needed rest more than I needed my own space, covering him with every blanket I owned while he drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring things in a language I didn't recognize, words that sounded both beautiful and dangerous falling from lips that I absolutely should not have been noticing in that particular way. I made him swallow the painkillers with water that he drank like a man dying of thirst. And then I settled into the chair beside my bed, my empty wallet sitting on the small table next to me like a monument to the choice I'd made, a choice that felt simultaneously like the worst and most important decision of my entire life. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, while I kept watch over this stranger who had crashed into my life like a meteorite, this man whose name I didn't even know, but who I'd saved with my last $6, and a compassion that I was starting to suspect might cost me far more than money before all was said and done. And as dawn began to creep through my window, painting the shabby room in shades of gray and gold, I sat there wondering who he was running from, who had shot him and left him for dead in an alley where no one was supposed to care, and whether the danger he'd warned me about was already on its way to my door, coming for both of us with the inexorable certainty of a storm that I could see gathering on the horizon, but was powerless to stop or escape. The stranger who I would come to know as Salvatore Constantine woke on the second day with a fever that burned through him like wildfire, his skin hot enough to scald when I pressed my palm against his forehead in the gray light of early morning. And I sat there beside my bed, where he'd been unconscious for nearly 40 hours, watching his chest rise and fall with breaths that seemed too shallow and too fast, wondering if saving him was going to mean watching him die anyway in my apartment, while I stood by helpless and terrified and completely out of my depth. I'd called in sick to work for 2 shifts now, telling Rosie that I had the flu, which wasn't entirely a lie since I felt sick to my stomach with worry and fear, and I'd spent money I absolutely didn't have at a pharmacy 3 neighborhoods over where nobody knew me, buying antibiotics from a man who operated out of a back room and didn't ask questions as long as cash was involved, the kind of underground transaction that I'd never imagined myself participating in, but which seemed almost mundane now compared to harboring a gunshot victim in my studio apartment. The fever broke sometime around 3 in the morning on that second night, and I was dozing fitfully in my chair, my neck cramped at an uncomfortable angle, and my whole body aching from lack of proper sleep, when I felt his eyes on me with an intensity that pulled me immediately into wakefulness, and I found him staring at me with a clarity and focus that was completely different from the pain-glazed semi-consciousness of the previous days, his dark eyes sharp and assessing, and filled with a suspicion that made my heart leap into my throat, even as some other part of me registered that he was finally, truly awake and aware and probably going to survive. He didn't speak at first, just watched me with the stillness of a predator evaluating potential threat, and I became acutely aware of how vulnerable I was in this moment, alone in my apartment with a man who was still dangerous despite his injury. A man who I knew absolutely nothing about, except that someone had wanted him dead badly enough to put a bullet in him and leave him bleeding in an alley. "Where am I?" he finally asked, his voice rough from disuse but carrying an undertone of command that suggested he was accustomed to asking questions and receiving immediate answers. And I found myself sitting up straighter in my chair, my hands twisting together in my lap while I explained that he was in my apartment, that I'd found him in the alley 2 nights ago, that I'd been taking care of him because he'd begged me not to call anyone. And with every word I spoke, I watched his expression shift through a series of micro-changes that I couldn't quite read. Suspicion giving way to confusion, giving way to something that might have been shock or disbelief. He asked me who I worked for, the question coming, out hard and sharp like an accusation, and I blinked at him in genuine confusion because I had no idea what he meant, telling him truthfully that I worked at Rosie's Diner on 5th Street, that I was a waitress and sometimes I sold my paintings at the weekend art market when I could afford the booth fee. And I watched as his entire body seemed to relax fractionally, as if my answer had confirmed something important, or perhaps eliminated some terrible possibility he'd been considering. "You don't know who I am," he said, and it wasn't quite a question but not quite a statement either. Something hovering in between that seemed to carry enormous weight. And I shook my head slowly, admitting that no. I had no idea who he was. I only knew that he'd been shot and bleeding, and I couldn't just leave him to die because that wasn't the kind of person I was, even if it probably should have been given where I lived and how the world actually worked. Something flickered across his face then, something that looked almost like wonder mixed with wariness, and he studied me for a long moment as if seeing me for the first time, really seeing me, taking in my paint-stained fingers and my cheap clothes and my shabby apartment with its peeling wallpaper and second-hand furniture, and I had the strangest sense that he was recalibrating everything he'd assumed about me and this situation, adjusting some internal calculation in ways I couldn't begin to understand. He told me his name then, Salvatore Constantine, letting it hang in the air between us as if expecting recognition or fear, or some kind of reaction that I simply didn't have because the name meant absolutely nothing to me. And I saw his eyebrows raise slightly when I just nodded and told him it was nice to properly meet him. My name was Iris Delacroix, and wasn't it lucky that the fever had broken, because I'd been worried the infection was going to spread despite the antibiotics I'd gotten him from a very questionable source that I'd rather not discuss in detail. He asked me how much the antibiotics had cost, his eyes never leaving my face, and I felt heat creep up my neck as I admitted they'd been expensive. Probably overpriced, actually. But I hadn't been in a position to negotiate, and he'd needed them urgently. And I watched his jaw tighten in a way that suggested anger, though I couldn't imagine what he had to be angry about, since I was the one who'd depleted my pathetic savings to keep him alive. The interrogation continued with him asking me question after question about who I'd told, who knew he was here, whether anyone had come looking. And I answered everything honestly because I had nothing to hide and no agenda beyond the simple fact that I'd found a dying man and helped him, which seemed to baffle Salvatore more than it reassured him, as if genuine compassion without ulterior motive was a concept so foreign to his experience that he literally didn't know how to process it. I finally grew frustrated with his suspicion and demanded some answers of my own, asking him who had shot him, who was after him, why I couldn't call the police, why he'd said that helping him would put me in danger, and I watched his face close off like shutters slamming down over windows, his expression going carefully blank, in a way that was somehow more frightening than his earlier suspicion, because it suggested a level of control and calculation that reminded me viscerally that I knew nothing about this man, except that violence followed him like a shadow. He told me partial truths, his words careful and measured, explaining that he'd been ambushed by business rivals, dangerous men who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone associated with him, that I was now at risk simply because I'd helped him, and if they found out where he'd been hiding, they would come for me to get to him. And every word he spoke landed in my stomach like lead weights because I could hear the truth underneath the vague explanations, could sense that what he wasn't saying was far more terrifying than what he was. I asked him what kind of business he was in that involved gunfights and assassinations, my voice coming out sharper than I'd intended. And he looked at me for a long moment before simply saying that it was the kind of business that good people like me should stay far away from, which wasn't an answer at all, but somehow told me everything I needed to know about exactly how deep the danger went. He tried to get up then, insisting that he needed to leave before he brought more trouble to my door, that I'd done more than enough and probably saved his life. But now he had to go, and I watched him swing his legs over the side of the bed with movements that were careful and controlled, but couldn't quite hide the way his face went gray with pain, couldn't quite mask the tremor in his hands as he tried to push himself to standing. The wound in his shoulder started bleeding again immediately, fresh red, seeping through the bandages I'd changed just hours before, and something fierce and protective surged up in me as I moved without thinking, putting my hands on his chest and pushing him back down onto the bed with a strength that surprised both of us, telling him in no uncertain terms that he was not going anywhere in this condition, that he could barely stand, much less walk or defend himself, and if these dangerous business rivals of his found him now, he'd be dead within minutes. We were close then, closer than we'd been since that first night in the alley, with my hands still pressed against his bare chest, where I could feel his heart beating strong and steady beneath my palms, could feel the heat of his skin and the hardness of muscle that tensed under my touch. And when I looked up to meet his eyes, I found him staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite name, something intense and searching and almost hungry that made my breath catch in my throat, and my own heart start, racing for reasons that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the electric current that seemed to arc between us in that moment. His hand came up to cover one of mine where it rested against his chest, his fingers wrapping around my wrist in a grip that was gentle but unmistakably possessive. And I knew I should pull away, should put distance between us, should remember that this man was dangerous and mysterious, and absolutely not someone I should be feeling attracted to. But I couldn't seem to make myself move. "You should be afraid of me, Iris," he said quietly, his accented voice dropping to something low and rough that sent shivers cascading down my spine, and his thumb traced small circles on the inside of my wrist where my pulse was hammering visibly against my skin. "Everyone else is. Everyone who knows my name knows to fear it. And you're here taking care of me like I'm just some ordinary man who needs help instead of someone who could destroy your entire life, without a second thought." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry, and heard myself say that maybe I was stupid or naive, or just too exhausted to be properly terrified. But he didn't feel like someone who would hurt me. Didn't feel like a threat despite everything he was saying and not saying. And I watched his eyes darken with something that looked like both warning and want as his grip on my wrist tightened just slightly. The moment stretched between us, taut as a wire about to snap, and I was acutely aware of every point where our bodies were in contact, of the heat radiating from him and the way his eyes kept dropping to my lips before forcing themselves back up to meet my gaze. And I knew that something fundamental was shifting between us. Some line being crossed that we couldn't uncross no matter what happened next. But then his face contorted with pain as the movement aggravated his injury, and the spell broke as I immediately shifted into caretaker mode, scolding him for tearing open his wound and making him lie back down while I went to get fresh bandages and antiseptic, my hands shaking slightly as I worked, and my mind spinning with thoughts I absolutely should not have been having about a patient I was nursing back to health. As I cleaned and rebandaged his shoulder, Salvatore made a decision that I could see forming behind his eyes even before he pulled his phone from the pocket of his ruined suit jacket that I'd hung over my single chair to dry, and he made a call in that language I didn't recognize, speaking in rapid-fire sentences that sounded both commanding and urgent. And when he hung up, he looked at me with an expression that was part apology and part determination, and told me that someone was coming to get him, that I needed to pack a bag with essentials, that I was coming with him whether I liked it or not, because his enemies would find this place eventually, and when they did, I needed to be long gone or I'd pay the price for my kindness, with my life. I started to protest, started to say that I couldn't just leave my apartment and my job and my whole life on the word of a stranger, even a stranger I'd saved and nursed and felt inexplicably drawn to. But he cut me off with a look that was pure steel beneath the exhaustion and pain, telling me that I'd made my choice when I'd helped him in that alley, that I'd tied my fate to his the moment I'd spent my last money on bandages instead of walking away. And now the only question was whether I was going to survive the consequences of that choice or become collateral damage in a war I didn't even know was being fought. His words hit me like physical blows because I could hear the truth in them, could understand with sudden horrifying clarity that the danger he'd warned me about wasn't hypothetical or distant, but immediate and real, and probably already closing in on my location. And I felt the walls of my small, safe, predictable life crumbling around me like sand castles before an incoming tide. The sound of expensive engines purring to a stop outside my building came less than an hour later, and I watched from my window as black Mercedes sedans, that probably cost more than I'd earn in 5 years, pulled up to the curb in front of my run-down apartment building, and men in suits that screamed money and danger emerged onto the rain-slicked street. And Salvatore was sitting up in my bed, despite my protests, already looking stronger and more alert, and infinitely more dangerous than he had any right to look, given that he'd been half dead just days before. He caught my expression as I stared down at the cars and the men, and he said quietly, almost gently, that I should prepare myself because everything was about to change. And when those men came upstairs and saw him, they were going to treat him very differently than I'd been treating him, and I needed to understand that the wounded stranger I'd saved was about to transform back into something else, entirely, someone else entirely, and that person was someone the entire criminal underworld had excellent reason to fear. The knock on my door came sharp and authoritative, and Salvatore told me to answer it, his voice carrying a note of command that I was beginning to recognize as his natural tone, the voice of someone accustomed to instant obedience. And when I opened the door with trembling hands, I found myself face to face with 3 men who looked like they could kill me without breaking a sweat. Men with cold eyes and bulges under their suit jackets that I knew were weapons. And the one in front asked in accented English where Don Constantine was, and I stepped aside mutely to let them enter, watching as they swept into my tiny apartment, and then stopped dead at the sight of Salvatore sitting on my bed. And in perfect synchronization, all 3 of them bowed their heads in a gesture of such profound respect and deference that my entire understanding of reality seemed to tilt sideways on its axis. And the leader said in a voice filled with relief and something that might have been reverence, "Don Salvatore, we've been searching everywhere for you. The entire organization has been mobilized. We thought you were dead." And Salvatore's response was calm and controlled as he gestured toward me and said words that would echo in my mind for days to come. "This woman saved my life with her last $6. She's under my protection now, and anyone who touches her answers to me personally." The Mercedes that carried us through the pre-dawn streets of the city was a monument to wealth and power that I'd never experienced before. All butter-soft leather and polished wood trim, and a silence so complete that I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird desperate for escape. And I sat pressed against the window watching my neighborhood disappear behind us, while Salvatore sat beside me with a stillness that seemed almost predatory, his dark eyes occasionally flicking to my face as if checking to make sure I hadn't dissolved into hysterics or attempted to throw myself from the moving vehicle. The men who'd come to collect him, Victor and 2 others whose names I hadn't caught in the chaos of leaving my apartment with nothing but a hastily packed duffel bag and the clothes on my back, treated Salvatore with a deference that bordered on worship, their voices dropping to respectful murmurs whenever they addressed him directly. And I watched this transformation from wounded stranger to commanding presence with a growing sense of unreality that made me wonder if I'd somehow fallen asleep in my chair. And this was all just a fever dream, born of exhaustion and stress. We drove for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes, leaving behind the warehouse district and the shabby neighborhoods I knew, passing through the commercial heart of the city, and then into areas I'd only seen in magazines or on television where the houses got bigger and the walls got higher and the very air seemed to shimmer with money and privilege that existed in a completely different universe from my own reality of overdue bills and secondhand furniture and meals that consisted primarily of ramen noodles and hope. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold when we turned through massive iron gates that swung open automatically at our approach, and I pressed my face against the window like a child as we drove up a long private drive lined with ancient oak trees that formed a canopy overhead, their branches interlacing to create a tunnel of leaves that filtered the early morning light into something ethereal and dreamlike. And at the end of that drive sat a house that made my brain short-circuit trying to categorize it, because calling it a house seemed insufficient when it was clearly a mansion, a palace, a fortress disguised as a home with its 3 stories of limestone and marble, its wings spreading out to either side of a central entrance that featured columns and balconies and architectural details I didn't have names for. The car pulled to a stop in front of steps that swept up to double doors that looked like they belonged in a museum, and I sat frozen in my seat, unable to process the sheer scale of wealth and power on display, unable to reconcile the man sitting beside me with this manifestation of extreme privilege and influence. And it wasn't until Salvatore's hand covered mine, where it was clenched white-knuckled on my thigh, that I managed to drag my eyes away from the mansion and meet his gaze. He looked at me with an expression that was almost apologetic, as if he understood exactly how overwhelming this was, and regretted the necessity of exposing me to it. And he told me quietly that this was his home, that I would be safe here, that he had an entire wing prepared for me with everything I could possibly need, and his words were meant to be reassuring, but instead they just highlighted how completely out of my depth I was in this situation, how utterly unprepared I was to navigate a world where people had wings of mansions to spare for unexpected guests. Victor opened the car door and offered me his hand to help me out, and I took it automatically, my legs unsteady as I stepped onto the gravel drive and tilted my head back to take in the full scope of the building that loomed above me like something out of a fairy tale. Except fairy tales didn't usually involve gunshot wounds and criminal organizations, and the kind of danger that Salvatore had warned me about. The inside of the mansion was even more overwhelming than the exterior, all soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers and marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, with art on the walls that I suspected was probably original and priceless, and definitely not the kind of thing that belonged in the same universe as my cheap poster prints and thrift store finds. And I followed Salvatore, through hallways that seemed to stretch on forever, past rooms whose purposes I couldn't even guess at, while staff members in crisp uniforms appeared and disappeared like ghosts, their eyes sliding over me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to poorly concealed disdain. The wing that Salvatore brought me to was larger than my entire apartment had been, a suite of rooms that included a bedroom, with a bed so massive I could have fit 5 of my old twin mattress on it, a bathroom done in marble and gold fixtures that looked like something out of a luxury hotel, a sitting room with furniture that was probably worth more than I'd earned in my entire life, and a walk-in closet that was completely empty, except for a few items that Salvatore explained had been purchased for me that morning while we were in transit. Clothes in my size that someone had apparently determined through means I didn't want to examine too closely. I stood in the middle of this opulent space with my pathetic duffel bag clutched in my hands, feeling like an imposter, like someone playing dress-up in a life that could never actually belong to me. And when I turned to face Salvatore, I found him leaning against the doorframe watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness despite everything else that was happening. He told me to rest, to explore the wing, to help myself to anything I needed, and that he would send someone up with food and to take my measurements for additional clothing, and I wanted to protest that I didn't need charity, didn't need to be dressed up like some kind of doll. But the words died in my throat because I was acutely aware that I was completely dependent on his generosity in this moment, that I had no money, no resources, no way to leave even if I wanted to, which I wasn't entirely sure I did despite the fear and confusion swirling through my mind like a hurricane. After he left, closing the door softly behind him, I sank down onto the edge of that enormous bed, and let myself process for the first time since those men had appeared at my apartment door that my entire life had been completely upended in the space of a few hours, that I was essentially a prisoner in a gilded cage, trapped by circumstances and choices that had seemed so simple in the moment, but whose consequences were sprawling out in directions I couldn't have anticipated. The days that followed were a study in contradictions, in luxury and captivity existing side by side in ways that made my head spin, and I found myself living a life that bore no resemblance to anything I'd known before. Waking in silk sheets instead of threadbare cotton, eating meals prepared by actual chefs instead of heating up ramen in my microwave, wearing clothes that fit perfectly and probably cost more than my monthly rent used to be. And all of it felt simultaneously wonderful and wrong, like I was wearing someone else's skin, and at any moment they were going to demand I give it back. Salvatore recovered with a speed that seemed almost supernatural, the gunshot wound healing cleanly thanks to the private doctor who visited daily, and the antibiotics that were apparently the good kind, not the sketchy underground pharmacy kind. And I watched him transform from patient to predator over the course of those first few days, his strength returning along with something harder and more dangerous in his eyes, the veneer of vulnerability that injury had created burning away to reveal the man underneath, the man that his enemies feared and his followers worshipped. Victor watched me constantly with cold suspicion that he didn't bother to hide, his ice-blue eyes following me whenever I ventured out of my wing and into the common areas of the mansion. And I knew without being told that he thought I was some kind of plant, a spy sent by rival organizations to infiltrate Salvatore's inner circle. And nothing I said or did seemed to change his mind because, in his world, genuine kindness without agenda simply didn't exist, and therefore my story of helping a stranger with my last $6 was either a cover for something sinister or evidence of stupidity so profound it was dangerous in its own right. I overheard him arguing with Salvatore one evening when I was supposed to be in my room, but had instead been wandering the halls trying to map out this massive house and maybe find some sense of normalcy in the opulent strangeness. And Victor's voice carried through a partially open door as he insisted that I was a liability, that keeping me here was a mistake, that I should be handled and eliminated before I could become a problem. And I froze in the hallway with ice flooding through my veins as I waited to hear how Salvatore would respond to the suggestion that I should be killed. Salvatore's response was quiet, but carried an edge of steel that made even me shiver, despite not being the target of his displeasure, and he told Victor in no uncertain terms that I was under his personal protection, that anyone who touched me would answer to him directly, that Victor's concerns were noted but overruled, and this topic was not open for further discussion. And I heard the dismissal in his tone, the absolute authority that said this decision was final and challenging. It would be a fatal mistake. I hurried back to my wing before either of them could discover I'd been eavesdropping, my heart racing, and my mind spinning with the implications of what I'd heard. The casual discussion of my potential murder delivered in the same tones someone might use to discuss ordering supplies or scheduling meetings, and I realized with stunning clarity that I was living in a world where human life was a commodity to be calculated and disposed of based on risk assessment and strategic value. And the only thing keeping me alive was Salvatore's inexplicable decision to protect me. The dinners were the worst and the best parts of my new existence. Intimate affairs where Salvatore insisted I join him in a dining room that could have seated 30, but where we sat at one end of an absurdly long table, close enough to talk, but far enough apart that every word had to cross a distance that felt metaphorical as much as physical. And we would eat food I didn't have names for while making conversation that danced around all the important topics, talking about art and books and music while carefully avoiding any discussion of his business or my status or the elephant in the room, which was that I was essentially his captive even if he never used that word, and treated me more like a guest than a prisoner. He asked me about my painting, seemed genuinely interested in my descriptions of trying to capture light and shadow on canvas, of the frustration and joy of creating something from nothing, and I found myself opening up to him in ways that surprised me, sharing dreams and aspirations I'd barely admitted to myself, and the whole time I was aware of the contradiction of confiding in a man who I knew was capable of violence, and probably responsible for deaths I didn't want to know about. A man whose world was built on fear and power, and the kind of moral flexibility that I'd been raised to condemn. But there were moments, small moments scattered through those days like diamonds in dirt, where I caught glimpses of something else beneath Salvatore's carefully controlled exterior. Flashes of humor and vulnerability that seemed almost shocking coming from someone who commanded such absolute authority. And I began to understand that he was as much a prisoner of his position as I was of my circumstances, trapped by expectations and responsibilities that had been thrust upon him by birth and circumstance rather than choice. He told me once, late at night over wine that cost more than I used to make in a month, that he'd never known genuine kindness without agenda, that every relationship in his life was transactional in some way, built on fear or obligation or mutual benefit, and that finding someone who helped him simply because it was the right thing to do, without knowing who he was or what he could offer in return, was so foreign to his experience that he literally hadn't known how to process it. And I heard the loneliness in his words, the isolation that came from being someone that everyone wanted something from but nobody actually knew. The sexual tension between us was a living thing that grew stronger with each passing day, building with every accidental touch and lingering glance, every moment where we stood just slightly too close, or let conversations stretch into territory that felt intimate and dangerous. And I knew I should resist it, should maintain distance and perspective and remember that this man was my captor even if he called me his guest. But there was something magnetic about him that pulled at me despite every logical reason to stay away, some combination of danger and intelligence and the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide that made me want to know him, to understand him, to touch him in ways that had nothing to do with cleaning wounds and everything to do with the heat that pooled low in my belly whenever he looked at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense I tried to maintain. We circled each other like planets locked in gravitational pull, neither willing to close the final distance but unable to break away, and the air between us crackled with possibilities that were both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. It all came to a head one evening in his study, a room I'd wandered into looking for a book, and found instead Salvatore standing by the window looking out over his grounds with a glass of whiskey in his hand, and an expression on his face that was so bleak and weary that it stopped me in my tracks. And when he turned and saw me, there was a moment where neither of us spoke, where we just looked at each other across the space of his study with all the unspoken words and suppressed desire hanging between us like smoke. And then he was moving toward me with a predatory grace that made my breath catch and my heart stutter, crossing the distance between us in strides that ate up the floor until he was right there, close enough that I could smell his cologne and feel the heat radiating from his body. And he reached out to cup my face with a hand that was gentle despite the calluses that spoke of violence and hard use. He backed me against the wall of his study with movements that were controlled and deliberate, giving me every opportunity to say no or pull away, even as his body caged mine in. And his hand slid from my face to my throat, not squeezing but just resting there, his thumb tracing the line of my pulse that was hammering visibly beneath my skin. And his voice when he spoke was rough and low and filled with warning, as he told me that I should fear him, that everyone else did, and they were right to because he was capable of terrible things, because his hands had blood on them that would never wash clean, because caring about him was a liability that could get me killed. And I looked up into his eyes that were burning with intensity and hunger, and something that might have been desperation. And I heard myself say in a voice that was breathier than I wanted but steady underneath, "Maybe that's why I don't fear you, because I've seen you at your most vulnerable, and you didn't hurt me then. And maybe everyone else's fear is exactly why you need someone who isn't afraid." And I watched something crack in his carefully maintained control, watched the walls he kept around himself start to crumble. And then his mouth was on mine, and I was kissing him back, with a passion that felt like falling and flying all at once, like stepping off a cliff into open air and discovering that maybe I could soar after all. The kiss ignited something between us that had been building since that first night in the alley, and Salvatore took me with a possessive intensity that should have terrified me but instead awakened something dark and hungry inside me that I hadn't known existed. Something that responded to the dangerous edge in his touch and the barely controlled violence that lurked beneath his careful restraint. And when he finally pulled back to look at me with eyes that were black with desire and something more complicated that I couldn't quite name, I found myself reaching for him again, pulling him back down to me because whatever this was between us felt inevitable and necessary and completely beyond my ability to resist even if I'd wanted to. The days that followed our first night together were a haze of passion and discovery, of learning the geography of his body with its scars and hard muscle, of finding that beneath the ruthless exterior he showed, the world was a man capable of tenderness and vulnerability that he shared with no one else. And I became his addiction just as he became mine, the one person in his corrupted world who saw him as something more than just the fearsome Don Salvatore Constantine. And he told me late one night with his arms wrapped around me and his face buried in my hair that he would burn the entire world down to keep me safe, that I had become more important to him than his empire or his power or even his own life. But paradise has a way of shattering just when you start to believe it might last forever. And mine came crashing down the day I decided to explore more of the mansion and stumbled into a wing I hadn't been to before, finding my way into what turned out to be Salvatore's private office, where files and documents were spread across a massive desk in organized chaos, and my artist's eye was drawn to photographs pinned to a board on the wall. Crime scene photos and surveillance images that showed the brutal reality of Salvatore's world in stark, horrifying detail. I stood frozen in that office, looking at evidence of violence and death, at files detailing operations and territories and wars between families with names I recognized from news reports about organized crime. And I found the file on the Morozov family, the rivals who had shot Salvatore. And I read about their systematic targeting of anyone connected to the Constantine organization, about the bodies that had piled up in the weeks since Salvatore's near death. And I realized with a sickening clarity that the danger he'd warned me about wasn't some abstract future threat, but an immediate and active campaign of violence that was claiming lives even as I lived in luxury and pretended that this could somehow be normal. When Salvatore found me standing there with shaking hands and tears streaming down my face, surrounded by the evidence of exactly what kind of man he really was, beneath the tender lover and careful protector, he didn't apologize or try to explain away the violence and death that his life entailed, and instead he looked at me with eyes that were hard and unflinching and told me that yes, he was a monster, that he had killed and would kill again, that his empire was built on fear and blood and the kind of ruthless calculation that ordinary people couldn't comprehend. And he'd warned me from the beginning what he was even if I'd chosen not to fully see it. We had a fight that shook the foundations of whatever we'd been building between us, with me demanding to know how he could touch me with hands that had taken lives, how he could whisper sweet words to me while ordering executions, how he expected me to just accept this world of violence and moral corruption as if it was somehow normal or acceptable. And he stood there and took my anger and my accusations without flinching, without defending himself, just letting me rage until I was exhausted and empty, and terrified of what staying with him would mean for my soul. I told him I was leaving, that I couldn't be part of this world, couldn't love someone who dealt in death and destruction no matter how tender he was with me, or how safe he made me feel. But when I actually tried to walk toward the door, he caught my wrist and spun me back to face him, and I saw something in his expression that was raw and desperate, and almost broken as he told me the truth I'd been trying not to see. That the Morozovs knew about me. That there were already photographs of me in their surveillance files. That leaving him didn't mean going back to my old life, but instead meant painting a target on my back that would get me killed within days, if not hours. He showed me the file they had on me, photographs taken outside the mansion, and during the brief times I'd ventured into the gardens, intelligence reports detailing my background and my connection to him, and a bounty offer that made my blood run cold with its casual assignment of monetary value to my death. And I understood then that my choice to help a bleeding stranger in an alley had irrevocably altered the course of my entire existence in ways I could never undo. The terrible mathematics of my situation became brutally clear as Salvatore laid out my options with a bluntness that left no room for comforting illusions. I could stay with him and accept the protection of his organization while living in a world of violence and moral compromise, or I could leave and almost certainly die at the hands of his enemies, who would use my death to hurt him and send a message to anyone else who might consider helping a Constantine. I sank down onto the leather couch in his office, my whole body shaking with the weight of understanding that there was no escape, no way back to innocence or normalcy, that the girl who'd worked at Rosie's diner and dreamed of selling paintings at art markets was gone forever, replaced by someone who had to choose between becoming part of darkness or being consumed by it. And I looked up at Salvatore with eyes that I knew held both accusation and desperate need as I told him that if I was going to stay, if I was going to be part of this world, then it would be on my terms. I demanded to understand his empire, to see the chess game he played with people's lives, to stop being some sheltered princess locked away from reality, because if I was going to live with the weight of this world on my conscience, then I needed to own it rather than hide from it. And I watched surprise flicker across Salvatore's face, followed by something that looked almost like respect, or perhaps recognition that I was stronger than he'd given me credit for. And he agreed to show me everything, to pull back the curtain on his operations, and let me see the machinery of power and violence that he commanded. Over the following days, he taught me to read the patterns of his world, showed me how intelligence gathering worked and how territories were controlled, explained the delicate balance of alliances and enmities that kept his empire stable, and I found myself drawn into the strategic complexity of it despite my moral objections, my artist's mind recognizing patterns and connections that others missed, seeing details in surveillance photographs that more experienced eyes had overlooked, and I realized that I had something to contribute beyond just being Salvatore's lover or his protected weakness. The attack came on a Tuesday evening when Salvatore and I were having dinner in the smaller dining room, a sudden explosion of violence as windows shattered and bullets tore through the air. And I watched Salvatore transform in an instant from the tender man who'd been holding my hand across the table into something lethal and controlled, throwing himself over me and driving us both to the floor while shouting orders in that language I still didn't understand. And security forces materialized from everywhere at once, returning fire while Salvatore shielded my body with his own. And I felt the impact as a bullet meant for me hit him instead, his body jerking against mine and his blood hot and wet soaking through both our clothes. The firefight lasted less than 5 minutes but felt like an eternity. And when the shooting finally stopped, and Salvatore rolled off me to check the wound in his side that was bleeding but not immediately life-threatening, I saw in his eyes a promise of retribution that was absolutely terrifying in its cold fury. And he looked at me lying there covered in his blood and told me in a voice that was soft but harder than diamonds that the Morozovs had just made their final mistake, that anyone who dared to threaten what was his would learn exactly why the Constantine name inspired fear. And as his men helped us both to our feet and secured the mansion while others went out hunting for the attack team, I realized that I had crossed some final threshold from victim to participant, and there was no going back from the choice I made in that moment when I looked at Salvatore and told him with absolute certainty that I wanted to be there when he made them pay for what they'd tried to do to us. The transformation from victim to participant to partner in Salvatore's world happened faster than I could have imagined possible, and in the days following the attack on the mansion, I stopped being the girl who needed protection and became someone who understood that survival in this world meant embracing its rules rather than fighting against them. And I used my artist's eye for detail to help Salvatore's intelligence team analyze surveillance footage from the attack, spotting inconsistencies in the security recordings that led us to discover a traitor within his own organization, someone who'd been feeding information to the Morozovs about our routines and vulnerabilities. And when Victor came to me personally to acknowledge that my observations had saved lives, and strengthened their defenses. I knew I'd finally earned my place at Salvatore's side in a way that went beyond just being the woman he loved. But Dmitry Morozov, the patriarch of the family that had been warring with the Constantines for control of the eastern territories, made one final catastrophic miscalculation when he decided that the best way to hurt Salvatore was to take from him the one thing that seemed to matter more than power, or territory, or pride. And I was taken from the mansion grounds during a carefully orchestrated diversion that drew most of Salvatore's security forces to the north gate, while a team came over the wall in the south. And I woke in a warehouse that smelled of rust and decay, with my hands zip-tied behind my back, and Dmitry Morozov himself standing over me with a smile that promised pain and death, and the kind of prolonged suffering that was meant to break both body and spirit. He told me with casual cruelty about all the ways he planned to hurt me, about how he would send pieces of me back to Salvatore until the great Don Constantine was reduced to a broken shell of a man, and he clearly expected me to beg or cry or give him the satisfaction of fear. But instead I looked up at him with eyes that I kept deliberately cold and calm, and I smiled as I told him that he'd made a terrible mistake, that Salvatore had taught me well, and that I'd hidden a tracking device in the lining of my jacket specifically for situations like this, which meant that his entire operation was already compromised, and he just didn't know it yet. The look on Morozov's face when he realized I wasn't the helpless innocent he'd assumed I was, that I'd been prepared for exactly this scenario, was almost worth the fear I was working so hard to suppress, and I kept him talking, using every psychological technique that Salvatore had taught me about manipulating opponents and gathering intelligence, asking questions that seemed born of curiosity, but were actually designed to extract information about his organization's structure and his future plans, and I could see his ego working against him as he boasted about operations and alliances, giving me details that I catalogued carefully in my memory, even as I worked the zip tie against the rough edge of the metal chair I was bound to, feeling the plastic slowly beginning to give way under the constant friction. When Salvatore arrived with what looked like his entire private army, the warehouse erupted into a firefight that was brutal and swift, and I'd already freed myself from the zip tie and taken the gun from the guard, who'd been too distracted by the assault to pay attention to his supposedly helpless captive. And when Salvatore burst through the door of the room where I was being held, he found me standing over Morozov, with the gun trained on him, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. And I saw pride and fear and fierce possessive love flash across Salvatore's face as he realized that I'd saved myself, even as he'd been racing to save me. We fought side by side in those final moments as Morozov's men made their last desperate stand, and I discovered that I was capable of violence when it meant survival, when it meant protecting the man I loved and the life we were building together. And when it was finally over and Morozov lay dead and his organization was shattered beyond repair, Salvatore pulled me into his arms in the middle of that blood-soaked warehouse and held me like I was the most precious thing in his world. And then he did something that shocked me more than anything else that had happened, dropping to his knees before me right there surrounded by his men and the aftermath of violence, looking up at me with eyes that held everything he felt but rarely spoke aloud. He told me that he'd built an empire on fear and power, and the kind of ruthless control that bent the world to his will, but that none of it meant anything without me. That I'd shown him what it meant to be seen and known and loved not despite the darkness but with full understanding of it, and he offered me not the role of protected princess or sheltered lover, but true partnership, asking me to stand beside him as his equal, to be the queen to his king in an empire that we would rule together. And I looked down at this powerful, dangerous, complicated man who'd transformed my life in every possible way, and I said yes, because I'd already made my choice the night I spent my last $6 to save a bleeding stranger. And everything that had happened since was just the universe showing me where that choice would lead. 6 months later, I stood in a designer gown that cost more than my old apartment's annual rent at a charity gala I'd organized, a legitimate front for laundering money and building political connections, and I worked the room with the same skill I'd once used to maximize tips at the diner. Except now I was cultivating relationships with politicians and business leaders and other power brokers who didn't know or didn't care that the beautiful couple hosting this elegant event ruled one of the most powerful criminal organizations on the eastern seaboard. I caught Salvatore watching me from across the ballroom with an expression of predatory pride that still sent shivers down my spine even after all these months, and I smiled at him over the champagne glass I was holding. This man who was my lover and my partner and my king. And I thought about the girl I'd been 6 months ago, struggling and scared, and convinced that kindness was a weakness in a world that rewarded ruthlessness, not knowing that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is also the most dangerous, that sometimes saving someone means damning yourself, and that sometimes damnation is exactly where you were meant to be all along. That night in our bedroom, in the massive bed where we'd first made love and built the foundation of our partnership, Salvatore traced the outline of my face with fingers that could be gentle or deadly depending on what the situation required, and he asked me if I ever regretted that night in the alley. If I ever wished I'd walked past him and kept my $6 and my innocence and my simple life. And I looked into his dark eyes that held secrets and violence and a love that was as obsessive as it was absolute. And I told him the truth. That I'd do it all again without hesitation. That those $6 had bought me something more valuable than I could have imagined. That they'd purchased not just his life, but my own transformation, my own power, my own understanding of who I could be when I stopped apologizing for wanting more than the world thought I deserved. I'd gone from struggling artist to mafia queen, from girl with empty pockets to woman who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. From someone who helped because it was right to someone who understood that right and wrong were far more complicated than I'd been taught. And as Salvatore pulled me close and whispered promises of forever in that language I was slowly learning, I reflected on the strange mathematics of fate. How $6 and one choice and a stranger's blood on my hands had led me to this moment, to this life, to this love that was as dark and dangerous and consuming as it was real. They say money can't buy happiness, that wealth and power are empty without meaning or purpose or connection. And maybe that's true for some people, for people who live in worlds of simple choices and clear morality. But I'd discovered that $6 could buy an empire when spent at exactly the right moment, that it could purchase a king who would burn the world for you, and a throne that you claimed not through birthright, but through your own strength and cunning and refusal to be anything less than what you were capable of becoming. And as I drifted off to sleep in Salvatore's arms with the weight of our shared darkness wrapped around us like a blanket, I thought about that girl in the alley who'd made an impossible choice with shaking hands and a desperate heart. And I silently thanked her for her courage, for her compassion, for her unwillingness to look away from suffering even when looking away would have been easier and safer and smarter. Because that choice, that single moment of deciding that $6 and human decency mattered more than self-preservation, had led me here to a life that was complicated and morally ambiguous, and absolutely mine in ways that my old existence never could have been. And I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world, not for safety or simplicity or the kind of innocence that I'd lost somewhere between the alley and the mansion. Between saving a stranger and becoming a queen, between the girl I was and the woman I'd chosen to become in the darkness that had turned out to be exactly where I belonged all along.